The story begins with a young boy proudly declaring that he was a wizard. Beside him, a little girl played along with their game and announced that she was a monster that ate wizards. The boy immediately told her to try eating his magic. As soon as he said that, he swung the stick he was holding and struck the girl on the top of her head, causing her to let out a small cry of pain. Furious, the little girl demanded to know why he had hit her for real. The boy, however, proudly replied that monsters were supposed to lose to wizards. Hearing that, the girl declared that she wanted to be a wizard too because it was unfair that she was the one getting beaten up. The boy immediately refused. As the two continued arguing, an old man could be seen watching them from a distance. Standing beside him were two other people, all of them smiling as they observed the energetic children. The old man eventually spoke up and remarked that they were certainly full of energy so early in the morning. Upon hearing his voice, both children immediately called out to him as Grandpa Rabus. The little boy then eagerly asked what he needed to do to become a wizard. Grandpa Rabus explained that becoming a wizard was not as simple as wanting to be one. He told the children that wizards were the apex of humanity, individuals who stood at the very top of society. They were nobles and knights who had inherited the ability to wield mysterious powers passed down through their bloodlines. Unfortunately, he added, neither of the two children standing before him could become wizards. One of the men beside Grandpa Rabus then spoke up and questioned how he could say something like that to children. Changing the subject, the man asked whether a certain rumor was true. Grandpa Rabus asked what rumor he was talking about. The man explained that he had heard monsters had appeared. Grandpa Rabus confirmed that the rumor was indeed true. Upon hearing that, the man was visibly surprised that the report was real. Grandpa Rabus continued, saying that he had heard that ROP encountered the creature near the village entrance the previous night. According to the reports, its entire body was shrouded in pitch-black shadows, and it was a leopard as large as a house. Despite the alarming description, Grandpa Rabus reassured everyone not to worry. He explained that the village chief had already traveled to the city to request the assistance of a wizard and would undoubtedly return with one. Once the wizard arrived, the monster would be subjugated. Hearing this, the woman finally let out a sigh of relief. She then gently patted the little girl's head and told her that she would not be allowed to enter the forest for the time being. Meanwhile, Grandpa Rabus picked up the stick lying on the ground and reminded everyone to remain cautious, explaining that without a wizard, killing a monster was nearly impossible. One of the men then asked whether the villagers were already aware of the situation. Grandpa Rabus replied that of course they were. Hearing that, the man brought up a particular person and asked if he knew about it as well. Confused, Grandpa Rabus asked who he was referring to. The man clarified that he meant the shepherd who lived on Hisril Hill, a boy named Tehran. At that moment, Tehran could be seen lying comfortably on the ground with one of his sheep serving as a pillow while he stared up at the sky. As he gazed into the distance, he complained that everything was boring. It was always the same scenery and the same day repeating over and over again. At this rate, he remarked, he might even forget how to walk. Just as he voiced his thoughts, a familiar voice called him a pathetic brat. The speaker was none other than Grandpa Rabus. Rabus scolded him, pointing out that the sun had not even begun to set, and yet he was already slacking off. Tehran casually replied that Rabus was blocking the sunlight and should move aside. Hearing that response, Grandpa Rabus criticized him for having no manners. Rabus then asked whether Tehran was still holding on to that incident from long ago, causing Tehran to look at him in confusion and ask what incident he was talking about. At that moment, Tehran seemed to remember something and asked Grandpa Rabus if he was referring to the time when Tehran's mother died and Rabus had tried to quietly turn the sheep into shared village property. Hearing that accusation, Rabus simply cleared his throat awkwardly. Tehran continued, saying that if that was the incident Rabus was talking about, then he was still upset because he was not generous enough to share his mother's inheritance. He added that the two of them were not close enough for Rabus to be asking how he was doing, so if Rabus had come all the way here, he should just say what he wanted and leave. Rabus was clearly irritated by Tehran's attitude, but Tehran remained completely unfazed. Staring at him with a menacing look, he pressed Rabus for an answer. Deciding to change the subject, Rabus informed him that a monster had appeared. He went on to explain that it was said to be a leopard as large as a house, and that ROP had been the one to discover it. Rabus added that he was returning after informing the rest of the villagers about the situation. As he gently petted one of his sheep, Tehran remarked that it sounded like a serious problem. Hearing that response, Rabus asked whether he was not afraid, considering that he was probably the most likely target living in the area. Rabus admitted that he did not know where Tehran got such courage from. He then explained that the village chief had already gone to the city to request the aid of a wizard and warned Turan to be careful until help arrived. Rebus added that he had come personally because he was worried about him. In response, Turan sarcastically remarked that Rebus was being very honest. However, he then pointed out that the old man was not actually worried about him at all and was instead worried about the sheep. That comment immediately made Rebus furious. Turan then changed his tone and bluntly told Rebus that if he was finished talking, he should leave already. To make matters worse, he added that Rebus's breath smelled so terrible that his nose was about to rot. Unable to endure any more insults, Rebus stormed off in a fit of anger. After the old man had left, Turan found himself thinking about the monster Rebus had mentioned. He reflected on the existence of beasts that wielded mysterious powers and magic. Just as humans had wizards, beasts had monsters. Turan then recalled Rebus's words about a wizard being summoned to such a remote village because of the monster. Thinking about it, he realized that he would finally have the chance to see a wizard in person. Even so, he reasoned that since the request had come from the chief of a rural village, there was a good chance the wizard would not be anything particularly impressive. Despite that thought, a smile still formed on his face as he admitted that he wanted to see one regardless. More than anything, he wanted to know just how strong a wizard truly was. However, while he was lost in those thoughts, his nose suddenly caught a distinct scent. The smile on his face immediately vanished, replaced by concern. The smell he had picked up was unmistakably blood. As the sun began to set, the sound of footsteps echoed through the area as Turan made his way toward the source of the scent. The closer he got, the stronger it became. Then, without warning, he came to a complete stop. Looking down, he found a lifeless body lying on the ground. It belonged to none other than Rebus himself. Staring at the old man's corpse, Turan remarked that Rebus had just warned him to be careful. Yet this was what had happened to him. After examining the wound, Turan carefully considered the situation and concluded that it was not the kind of injury an ordinary wild animal could inflict. There was only one explanation. This had to be the work of a monster. As Turan was thinking about the situation, he suddenly became alert. Heavy footsteps echoed through the area, rapidly approaching his position. Moments later, a gigantic beast enveloped in a black and menacing aura emerged from the darkness. As the creature drew closer, Turan and the monster finally came face to face, standing opposite one another in a tense standoff. Elsewhere, the little boy from the village asked his father how strong a monster really was and whether it was true that even adults could not defeat one. His father replied that monsters were unbelievably powerful and that if ordinary adults like him charged at one recklessly, there would not even be enough left of them to collect their bones. Hearing that, the boy nervously asked what would happen to the village. His father reassured him not to worry, explaining that the village chief would return with a wizard and that the wizard would subjugate the monster. The boy then asked whether the wizard could possibly lose and whether the wizard would punish the monster. His father confidently answered that, of course, the wizard would win. He explained that wizards were extraordinary beings born with the power of magic and that they could kill a monster with a single word. Back at the confrontation, the monster suddenly launched itself toward Turan. Despite the terrifying sight, Turan remained completely still, not showing even the slightest trace of fear in his eyes. He calmly opened his mouth and uttered a single command for the creature to die. The moment those words left his lips, the monster instinctively leaped backward, distancing itself from him without understanding why. Staring at Turan, the beast could sense a terrifying aura radiating from his body. Turan, however, seemed slightly surprised that his command had not worked as intended. While he was pondering that, the monster gathered its courage and charged at him once more. This time, Turan simply commanded it to stop. As soon as the word was spoken, the monster abruptly retreated again, backing away from him, as if driven by an instinctive fear it could not resist. Turan then muttered to himself that he had already expected killing the monster with a direct command would not work, but he was still surprised that even stopping it was impossible. Enraged, the monster slammed its massive paws into the ground and glared at Turan with murderous intent. Turan, however, wasted no time preparing for battle. Deciding to approach the situation differently, he reached into his pocket and pulled out several small stones. Wearing a confident smile, he remarked that a shepherd should do what a shepherd does. The monster lowered its body and prepared to charge once more, but before it could move, Turan spoke a command to harden. Instantly, the stone in his hand became far tougher than before. He placed it into his slingshot and followed up with another command, this time ordering it to become faster. Taking a fierce step forward, he swung the slingshot with all his strength and uttered yet another command to pierce through. The stone shot forward in a streak of blue light and flew straight toward the monster. A moment later, it struck the side of the beast's cheek, drawing blood. Furious after being wounded, the monster immediately charged at Turan with full force. Yet Turan did not move even an inch. Instead, he stood there smiling. It was then revealed that his true target had never been the monster's cheek, but its head. High above them, the stone that had been launched into the air began falling back down. As it descended, Turan calmly spoke one final command and ordered it to pierce through the monster's head. The hardened stone accelerated downward at incredible speed and drilled directly through the beast's skull, killing it instantly. As the dust gradually settled, the monster's lifeless body lay motionless on the ground. Looking at the corpse, Turan remarked that it was his first time using that method on a monster. Staring at the dead beast, he wondered whether he should simply throw the body into a valley somewhere. He then clicked his tongue in annoyance and complained that those villagers had certainly given him a troublesome job. Turan was a wizard, a fact he had discovered 8 years earlier when he was only 10 years old. On that day, he had been excitedly making pieces of furniture float high into the air. Smiling brightly, he ran over to his mother and proudly told her that the furniture was flying. Overflowing with excitement, he continued explaining that he could also create fire and even control the wind. The memories of that day remained vivid in Turan's mind. However, something completely unexpected had happened afterward. His mother suddenly told him to stop what he was doing. It was the first and only time she had ever become angry with him. Young Turan could not understand why she was upset and was left completely confused by her reaction. His mother then knelt down in front of him and gently asked him to come talk with her. She began by asking whether he wanted to stay by her side and live with her for a long time. Without hesitation, Turan answered that he did. Hearing his response, his mother asked him to make a promise. She told him that from that day onward, he must never use his powers again and that he must never reveal those abilities in front of other people. Confused, Turan asked why. In response, his mother asked whether he remembered the story about the nobles and the knights. Turan replied that he did. He recalled that people who possessed such special powers were called wizards, regardless of whether they were nobles or knights. However, nobles and knights were fundamentally different from one another. Nobles were said to be descendants of the divine, people known as the Freyans, who had descended to save the ancient humans, while knights were descendants of those nobles whose bloodlines had gradually mixed with ordinary humans over time. Hearing his answer, Turan's mother was pleased that he remembered the story so well. She then explained that this was the reason nobles and knights were distinguished from one another, even among wizards. With that, she prepared to tell him the true reason why he could never use his powers openly. Turan's mother then explained that he had inherited his powers from his father, who had been a knight. She warned him that there were many cruel nobles beyond the boundaries of their village, nobles who treated knights as little more than slaves. Because of that, she told Turan to always remember one thing: no one could ever learn that he was a wizard. After saying that, she asked him whether he could keep that promise for her. Since that day, 8 years had passed. Throughout all that time, Turan had faithfully upheld the promise he made to his mother, and he had no intention of ever breaking it. He thought to himself that he had no desire to reveal his identity as a wizard or leave the mountain to enter the wider world. Not long afterward, a loud banging suddenly echoed through the door of Turan's home. Someone outside was repeatedly calling for him to come out. The moment Turan opened the door, he was met by a group of men who were glaring at him with obvious hostility. After a brief exchange of words, Turan let out a long yawn and casually asked whether they were accusing him of being responsible for Rebus's death. At that moment, one of the men grabbed him by the collar and angrily called him a shameless human being for harming old man Rebus. The man further accused him of abandoning Rebus's body to be eaten by monsters. Hearing those accusations, Turan remained silent for a moment. Then he calmly spoke up and remarked that he could understand why they wanted to frame him. The men were visibly confused by his response. Turan continued, pointing out that the oldest man in the village had died alone while the younger men had been too frightened to confront the monster themselves. As he spoke, he explained that he could see why they believed blaming him was the easiest solution. A devious smile spread across his face as he added that shifting the blame onto him was far more convenient than facing their own cowardice. Enraged by his words, one of the men shouted Turan's name and raised his fist, ready to strike him. However, Turan reacted instantly and effortlessly dodged the incoming punch. He did not stop there. In the same motion, He drove a powerful headbutt into the man's face, sending blood pouring from his nose. As the man collapsed to the ground, the remaining villagers rushed toward Turan together. Turan immediately made use of his magic, causing one of the attackers to lose his footing and fall. At the same time, he avoided another strike aimed at him and swiftly grabbed the attacker's arm. Using the man's own weapon against him, Turan slammed it directly into the man's head. Even then, he was not finished. Several opponents still remained, but Turan dealt with them with ease. Within moments, every one of the men was lying unconscious on the ground while Turan stood calmly in the middle of the battlefield, completely victorious. Magic was an incredibly convenient tool for him, though it consumed mana whenever he used it. He reflected that he had only used a tiny amount of his power during the fight, just enough to ensure the men would not notice anything unusual while also preventing them from being seriously injured. In this way, he was able to dominate them while continuing to conceal the fact that he was a wizard, a secret he had successfully hidden for 8 years. After dealing with the men, Turan remarked that they should have used that strength to prepare Rabus's funeral instead. He then turned toward the women who had accompanied them and asked whether they had also come to fight. Panicking, the women immediately denied it and hurriedly explained that they had only come to watch. Turan was not entirely convinced by their explanation, but he told them to take the unconscious idiots with them and leave. Sometime later, Turan returned inside his house. As he removed his coat, he thought to himself that the village was about to descend into chaos once again. He was certain that the villagers would use this incident as an excuse to cheat him the next time he went to trade with them. Even so, he did not seem particularly concerned. He simply reasoned that if they refused to give him a fair deal, he could always beat them up until they did. Speaking to himself, Turan remarked that he had given the men a proper beating, so they should not be coming back anytime soon. However, just as he was finishing that thought, another knock echoed from the door. Hearing it, Turan could only think that those people had to be completely insane. Already irritated, Turan angrily opened the door and demanded to know who it was, asking if they had come back for another beating. However, the person standing outside was not one of the villagers. Instead, a large and unfamiliar man stood at the entrance. Seeing the stranger, Turan immediately asked who he was. The man calmly replied that he had hoped to ask for a favor during his travels, but it seemed he had arrived at an unfortunate time. Confused, Turan wondered if the man was a traveler. Realizing his mistake, he quickly denied what the stranger had assumed and apologized, explaining that several unwelcome guests had just visited him a short while ago. As he said that, Turan thought about the manners his mother had taught him and wondered whether he was behaving properly enough. Since he rarely spoke politely to anyone in the miserable little town, the entire situation felt strangely awkward to him. While observing the traveler, Turan suddenly noticed the sword hanging at the man's side. It struck him as unusual to see someone carrying a weapon in such a sleepy and isolated town. Just as he was about to ask whether the traveler was looking for an inn, the man's stomach let out a loud growl. Hearing it, Turan released a long sigh and reluctantly invited the traveler inside. A short while later, a variety of food had been laid out before the guest. As the traveler began eating, Turan apologized and explained that he was not particularly wealthy, so he could not offer much. The man immediately disagreed, remarking that the meal was more of a feast than he had expected. After eating for a while, the traveler changed the subject and admitted that Turan had surprised him. Earlier, Turan had mentioned that he had never met anyone from outside the town before, and when the traveler brought it up again, Turan confirmed it with a nod. He explained that he had been born and raised on the hill and had spent his entire life working as a shepherd. Because of that, it was extremely rare for him to encounter visitors, especially in such a small and remote settlement. As the traveler sipped from his cup, he carefully observed Turan, watching the young man eat and drink with a level of grace and refinement that seemed out of place for an ordinary shepherd. The traveler eventually remarked that it was quite interesting. Hearing that comment, Turan was left confused and wondered why the man would say such a thing. The man then continued, remarking that for someone who had grown up in such a remote place as a shepherd, Turan was surprisingly well-mannered. He added that Turan's parents must have done an excellent job raising him. Turan replied that he had learned everything from his mother, but sadly, she had passed away several years earlier due to an illness. Hearing that, the man told Turan that a woman capable of raising such a fine and respectable son was surely dwelling among the gods in the heavens. As he spoke, he offered a brief prayer for her soul. Sometime later, after they had finished their meal, the traveler once again thanked Turan for his hospitality. Turan simply responded that he was only living according to the values his mother had taught him. He then changed the subject and asked what had brought the man all the way to such a rural town. The traveler explained that he had come because he had been asked to take care of a problem. Curious, Turan listened as the man revealed that he had been sent to deal with a monster puma. He then casually added that he was a wizard. Hearing that, Turan could not hide his surprise. He immediately remarked that the traveler must be the wizard the village elder had spoken about. The man confirmed that he was correct. While chewing on a piece of beef jerky, the wizard then asked whether he could ask Turan a question. Turan agreed without hesitation. The man explained that he had sensed the presence of a monster in the area, yet he had not found any trace of it. What puzzled him even more was that Turan clearly knew about both the village elder and the monster, yet he remained completely calm and showed no intention of fleeing. Hearing those words, Turan immediately became alert. The wizard continued, pointing out that if the monster had targeted a human, Turan would have been the most likely victim. Because of that, he found it strange that Turan was not frightened at all. In fact, he seemed unusually brave for a shepherd who had supposedly spent his entire life in this isolated town. As he finished speaking, the wizard's expression turned noticeably more intimidating. Fixing Turan with a sharp gaze, he finally asked the question that had been on his mind from the beginning. Who exactly was Turan? In a flashback to the past, Turan asked his mother why nobody could know that he was a wizard. His mother replied that it was because of the bad nobles, but Turan was confused by her explanation. Seeing his confusion, she continued by comparing nobles and knights to shepherds and their dogs. She explained that if nobles were shepherds like them, then knights were like the dogs that shepherds kept. They might be treated with affection and regarded as family, but in the end they could still be sold away or sacrificed whenever it became necessary. After saying that, Turan's mother admitted that she did not want such a life for him. She then asked whether he wanted to continue living with her, and Turan immediately answered yes. Hearing that response, his mother told him to remember her words carefully. No one could ever learn that he was a wizard, especially other wizards. If they discovered the truth, they would separate the two of them and turn Turan into nothing more than a shepherd's dog, something that could be discarded at any moment. Back in the present, Turan continued recalling those memories. He remembered his mother warning him that in order to keep his identity hidden, there might come a day when he would have to kill people. Now, as he faced the wizard sitting across from him, the two stared at each other in complete silence. Looking at the man, Turan thought to himself that this was what everything had ultimately led to. Breaking the silence, the wizard asked why Turan could not answer his question. After a long pause, however, the man suddenly smiled and remarked that making such a serious face only made his joke awkward. Turan was taken aback, realizing that the wizard had not been serious at all and had only been teasing him. He quickly apologized and admitted that he did not really have much of a sense of humor. The wizard immediately shook his head and said that he was the one who should apologize, explaining that he thought he had flustered Turan. With a faint smile finally appearing on his face, Turan replied that it was his first time hearing a joke from a wizard, so it had caught him completely off guard. The man laughed and admitted that Turan's reaction had been so entertaining that he had ended up taking the teasing a little too far. The man then extended his hand and remarked that, now that he thought about it, neither of them had properly introduced themselves yet. With that, he introduced himself as Kjorn and explained that he was a wanderer. Turan shook Kjorn's hand and apologized, saying that he should have introduced himself first. He then gave his own name and explained that he was a shepherd. Sometime later, the two continued their meal together while chatting. During their conversation, Turan mentioned that he was 18 years old that year. In response, Kjorn revealed that he would be turning 75. Hearing that, Turan was genuinely surprised and remarked that Kjorn did not look nearly that old. Kjorn explained that wizards aged much more slowly than ordinary people and generally lived far longer lives. Curious, Turan asked how Kjorn had ended up becoming a wanderer. Kjorn replied that after serving the Erebion family for 60 years, he had eventually decided to leave. As he grew older, he found himself wanting to travel from place to place rather than remain tied to a single location. Hearing that story, Turan commented that it sounded rather romantic. As their conversation continued, Turan found himself quietly reflecting on the situation. Sharing a simple and harmless conversation with a genuinely good person was surprisingly enjoyable, and he had never realized how pleasant such an experience could be. Before long, the day had slipped away and the sun was beginning to set. Kjorn remarked that it had already become so late, and Turan agreed, admitting that he had not even noticed the passage of time. Kjorn then rose to his feet and said that it was time for him to leave. Before departing, he handed Turan a silver coin and explained that it was an Erebion silver coin, known for being among the purest silver currencies in circulation. He added that it should be more than enough to cover the cost of a meal. Turan gratefully accepted the payment and wished Kjorn success in his hunt before seeing him off. However, Kjorn told Turan not to act as though they would never see each other again. He jokingly added that he might stop by several more times during his travels to mooch meals off him. With those words, he departed. The following day was bright and sunny. As the sheep peacefully grazed on the grass, Turan called for them to gather. Upon hearing his voice, the sheep obediently made their way toward him. While watching them, Turan found himself reflecting on the previous day. It had been the first time he had ever met another wizard, but more importantly, he could not remember the last time he had enjoyed a conversation that felt so natural and comfortable. The ease with which they had spoken, the humor that had naturally worked its way into their conversation, and Kjorn's warm personality had left a strong impression on him. More than any adult Turan had met in his life, Kjorn seemed like a genuinely good person. Sometime later, Kjorn returned to visit Turan's home, carrying the corpse of a dead wolf across his back. Back in the present, Turan reflected on how he had always believed knights were nothing more than emotionless hunting dogs used by arrogant nobles. After meeting Kjorn, however, that belief no longer seemed entirely true. Feeling conflicted, Turan wondered how he was supposed to explain to Kjorn that there were no longer any monsters on Hisaril Hill. Meanwhile, Kjorn was wandering through the forest, carefully examining the area. As he looked around, he found the situation increasingly strange. There were obvious traces of a fierce battle, yet he could not sense the presence of any monster. While investigating further, his gaze landed on a stone embedded deep into the top of a tree trunk. Seeing it, he began to suspect that the monster might have already been hunted down. Kjorn wondered who could have possibly killed it and briefly considered whether the village chief had secretly hired another wizard in addition to him. Regardless of who had done it, Kjorn ultimately decided that it was a relief. As far as he was concerned, if someone had already eliminated the monster and restored safety to the area, then that was all that truly mattered. However, just as Kjorn was thinking that, he suddenly sensed something unusual. An ominous aura washed over the area, instantly putting him on alert. Without hesitation, he rushed toward the source of the presence. The sound of rapid footsteps echoed through the forest, and moments later, he came face to face with a grotesque monster possessing a twisted and dysfunctional face. The sight immediately caused Kjorn to wonder if he was looking at a monster's wraith. Confused, he questioned who would have allowed something like this to happen. Before he could think further, the creature lashed out with its enormous claws. Kjorn reacted quickly and narrowly dodged the attack. As he retreated, he recalled a fundamental fact known to all monster hunters. If the mana within a slain monster's corpse was not absorbed or dispersed, the monster could transform into a wraith like the one standing before him. A wizard who hunted monsters should have known that. Leaping high into the air to avoid another attack, Kjorn concluded that whoever had killed the original monster had definitely been a wizard. The real question was why that wizard had allowed the corpse to become a wraith. For a brief moment, he considered the possibility that the individual simply did not know that dead monsters could transform if their mana was left behind. He quickly dismissed the idea. A novice knight ignorant of something so basic would never have been capable of killing a monster of this level in the first place. As mana gathered around him, Kjorn wondered whether the wizard responsible had some hidden motive. In the end, however, he pushed the thought aside. Whatever the reason, the wraith had to be destroyed. With that decision made, he summoned a magical bow, an arrow, and immediately fired at the creature. Just as the arrow was about to strike its target, it suddenly vanished into thin air. The unexpected sight caught Kjorn completely off guard. Staring in disbelief, he realized that his magic had somehow been nullified. The possibility immediately crossed his mind that the monster's mana might be vastly stronger than his own. While he was still processing what had happened, the wraith abruptly disappeared from sight. Kjorn's eyes widened in surprise. He wondered if the creature was actually using magic to counter magic. As he searched the area for any trace of it, the monster had already moved behind him. Wasting no time, it appeared directly at his back and unleashed a powerful slash. The attack struck Kjorn's arm, tearing through his flesh and drawing blood. Feeling the pain, Kjorn immediately realized that this was not an opponent an ordinary knight could hope to contend with. At the very least, someone would need the strength of a lower-ranked noble to stand a chance against a monster of this caliber. In that moment, the monster's attack forced Kjorn several steps backward. As he steadied himself, he thought that he had never expected to encounter a monster wraith of this caliber in some remote mountain village. He bitterly reflected that life truly had a way of throwing unexpected challenges at people. The monster then let out a deafening roar as it prepared to deliver the finishing blow. Realizing the situation, Kjorn thought to himself that this was likely as far as he would go. Even so, he smiled and gritted his teeth, refusing to die without a fight. If he was going to die, he would at least drag the monster down with him. Gathering every last bit of mana into his hand, he calculated that if he could stab the creature directly at the moment it lunged, there was still a chance of killing it. Without wasting another second, Kjorn charged straight toward the monster, while the monster simultaneously rushed toward him. Just as the two were about to collide, a brilliant blue light suddenly shot out from a distance. Traveling at incredible speed, the blue streak raced toward the monster and, within an instant, pierced straight through its body, killing it on the spot. Kjorn stared in shock at the sight before him. As he looked at the lifeless corpse of the monster, a voice suddenly called out and asked whether he was all right. The moment he heard it, Kjorn immediately recognized who it belonged to. With a faint smile, he remarked that a shepherd's joke could be quite startling as well. As he said that, Turan emerged from the shadows. Kjorn then directly asked whether Turan was a wizard. Turan simply answered yes. Kjorn followed up by asking why he had never told him the truth. In response, Turan remained silent for several seconds. Seeing that he was unwilling to answer, Kjorn changed the question and instead asked why Turan had helped him just now when he could have easily walked away and left him to his fate. Just as Turan was about to respond, the scene shifted. A dead animal could be seen lying on the ground, and in a quiet room, Turan and Kjorn sat beside each other. Turan then asked Kjorn why he was going so far for the sake of the villagers. Hearing that, Kjorn asked what he meant. Turan explained that he did not know what the village chief had promised him. But with Kjorn's abilities, he felt that Kjorn could earn far more money while living a much more comfortable life elsewhere. In response, Kjorn let out a laugh. He then remarked that the villagers were pitiful people. Curious, Turan asked in what way they were pitiful. Kjorn explained that they lived on the frontier, constantly trembling in fear without even the most basic protection. Hearing that, Turan pointed out that their situation was not Kjorn's fault. Kjorn replied that a wizard was, by nature, someone who had inherited the power of the gods. Because of that, he believed that wizards should take pride in protecting powerless commoners. However, he also admitted that not every wizard shared his way of thinking and that everyone had their own beliefs and their own way of living. Hearing those words, Turan smiled. Returning to the present while recalling that conversation, he looked toward Kjorn and repeated that everyone had their own way of living. At that very moment, the monster, which they had believed to be dead, suddenly moved again and launched another attack. Fortunately, both of them managed to dodge before the strike could hit. Kjorn immediately told Turan to listen carefully. He explained that the creature was far beyond a level they could handle and that it was a monster that could not be fought unless one possessed the power of a noble. Kjorn then instructed Turan to immediately inform the village chief and help evacuate the villagers. As he said that, Kjorn stepped forward and positioned himself between the monster and Turan, declaring that he would hold the creature off until then. As he said that, Kjorn thought to himself that he had spoken boldly, but in truth he had no idea how long he could actually hold out against the monster. However, before he could dwell on that thought any further, Turan suddenly spoke up and told him that it would be fine. Kjorn was immediately confused by what Turan meant. Turan then explained that if his previous attack had landed properly, he believed everything would have been fine already. Hearing that, Kjorn asked what exactly he was talking about. He began to wonder if Turan was implying that he had not been fighting with his full strength. The thought left Kjorn stunned. He had never expected to find such a young knight hidden away in the mountains, much less one capable of hunting a wraith that even nobles would struggle to deal with. As a veteran knight, Kjorn could immediately recognize talent when he saw it. What stood before him was not merely a chance acquaintance he had met in a remote village, nor was it the reckless confidence of a young knight who had fled from the nobles. The scene unfolding before his eyes felt like the beginning of a wizard who might one day turn the world upside down. While Kjorn was lost in those thoughts, he witnessed the tremendous power radiating from Turan. Turan smiled and admitted that he was curious about his own limits as well. The moment he said those words, hundreds of stones began levitating into the air around him. Just as Turan was about to take over the battle, Kjorn suddenly objected and declared that he would not allow him to fight alone. He insisted that no matter how extraordinary Turan's talent was, the monster remained a formidable opponent. Because of that, they needed to join forces. However, before he could finish speaking, the monster lunged toward Kjorn in an attempt to attack him. In that instant, Turan unleashed a powerful strike that slammed directly into the creature, sending it flying backward at tremendous speed. Witnessing the attack, Kiorn suddenly realized something. At that moment, he would only get in the way. The attack had been so fast and overwhelming that he had not even been able to react to it. At that moment, Kiorn realized that he was of little help in the battle. Instead, he concluded that what he needed to do now was help Turan's talent fully bloom. As that thought crossed his mind, Turan launched another powerful attack that sent the monster flying backward once again. However, rather than feeling encouraged, Turan grew irritated. Despite the force of his attacks, the monster simply kept getting back up. Sure enough, the creature rose to its feet once more and immediately resumed its assault. Seeing this, Kiorn called out to Turan and explained that a wraith could not be killed through physical attacks alone. Hearing that, Turan asked how he was supposed to kill it while simultaneously dealing with the monster's relentless charge. Kiorn quickly replied that he needed to use elemental attacks, such as fire or lightning. Without wasting any time, Turan followed the advice and unleashed a powerful fire attack at the monster. However, the moment it connected, he realized that it was not having the desired effect. Kiorn immediately clarified that Turan had misunderstood his explanation. As he watched the battle unfold, Kiorn reflected on a fundamental principle of wizardry. In order to apply a wizard's power to another living being, establishing proper causality was one of the most basic requirements. The realization left him stunned. He began to wonder if Turan truly lacked even the most basic common knowledge expected of a wizard. Then another thought suddenly struck him. What if Turan had been the one who killed the original monster and unknowingly left the corpse behind to become a wraith? As the pieces fell into place, Kiorn came to a shocking conclusion. If that were true, then Turan had likely never absorbed mana from a defeated monster in his entire life. The idea astonished him. Despite never absorbing mana, Turan had already reached such an incredible level of strength. Deciding to guide him, Kiorn quickly offered some advice. He told Turan not to simply ignite fire on the target, but instead to create the fire first and then launch it as an attack. Hearing the instruction, Turan immediately stopped what he was doing and focused his mana. Moments later, a mass of fire began gathering in his hand. As Kiorn observed him, he reflected that creating fire was not difficult for a wizard. The real challenge lay in controlling it properly, a skill that normally required separate training and experience. However, while Kiorn was thinking that, Turan had already successfully gained control over the fire he had summoned, leaving Kiorn visibly surprised. Without hesitation, Turan stepped forward and launched the blazing attack directly at the monster. The moment the attack connected, the creature burst into flames and let out a horrifying scream of pain. Even so, Kiorn knew the battle was not over yet. He immediately called out to Turan, telling him to stay focused and continue pouring mana into the flames so they would not go out. Kiorn explained that he needed to burn away every trace of the wraith until nothing remained. Hearing those instructions, Turan maintained his concentration and steadily fed mana into the fire. Within seconds, the monster was completely reduced to ashes. Clutching his injured hand, Kiorn stared in disbelief. They had actually won. The creature had been an absurdly powerful wraith, one that ordinarily required at least the strength of a noble-class wizard to defeat, yet Turan had taken it down almost entirely on his own. Kiorn then turned his attention toward Turan, who stood there silently. After a brief pause, Turan asked whether it was finally over. Kiorn replied that if Turan wanted to avoid creating another wraith, he needed to absorb the remaining mana first. Hearing that, Turan asked how he was supposed to do it. Kiorn instructed him to imagine drawing something into himself. Turan nodded, stretched out his hand, and said that he understood. Closing his eyes, he focused on the task. Almost immediately, purple mana began flowing out of the remains of the monster. Within moments, the energy streamed into Turan's body and spread throughout him. When he opened his eyes again, he could feel the mana dispersing to every corner of his body. Shocked by the sensation, he stared at his own hands in disbelief. Kiorn stepped forward and explained that Turan would likely experience a certain feeling of pleasure from the process. As he watched the scene unfold, Kiorn could only shake his head in amazement. Even after witnessing it with his own eyes, he still found it difficult to believe what he had just seen. Kiorn then asked Turan if this had truly been his first time absorbing mana, and Turan answered that it was. Hearing that, Kiorn fell deep into thought. He knew that after a wizard's initial awakening, Mana naturally increased with age, but the most effective way to grow stronger was by killing monsters or other wizards and absorbing their mana. Yet this had been Tehran's very first absorption, and despite that, he had already demonstrated magical abilities at an astonishing level. That could only mean one thing. Tehran's innate potential existed on an entirely different level from ordinary wizards. As this realization dawned on him, Kjorn suddenly figured something out. He called out Tehran's name, and when Tehran responded, Kjorn lowered his head and offered a sincere apology. He admitted that he had been extremely rude and then respectfully asked which noble house Tehran belonged to. However, Tehran immediately called out Kjorn's name in return. When Kjorn looked at him, Tehran calmly told him to wipe the blood off first. Only then did Kjorn remember the injury he had suffered during the battle. Some time later, after his wound had been treated, Kjorn once again spoke up. He told Tehran that making someone as esteemed as him tend to his injuries was something he could only apologize for. However, Tehran's expression immediately darkened. Looking slightly annoyed, he reminded Kjorn that he had already said he was not some esteemed individual. He was merely a shepherd who did not even know who his father was. As he spoke, he fixed Kjorn with a sharp glare and told him to stop talking like that. Seeing Tehran's reaction, Kjorn agreed and said that he would believe him. Even so, he could not help asking why a wizard as powerful as Tehran would choose to live as a shepherd. He quickly clarified that he was not trying to belittle him, but the lifestyle simply did not seem to suit someone with Tehran's abilities. Tehran then explained that it had been his mother's request. She had told him to live this way, and he had continued honoring that wish right up until the moment she died. He went on to explain that beyond the mountain lived the nobles, and according to his mother, if it was ever revealed that someone was a wizard, the nobles would simply use them and discard them when they were no longer useful. Hearing that explanation, Kjorn remarked that Tehran's mother had been a wise woman. That response immediately earned him a confused look from Tehran. Tehran then added that he was surprised because he had thought Kjorn would call it nothing more than overprotective parenting, but Kjorn replied that Tehran's mother was not entirely wrong. Wizards possessed great power, and great power inevitably brought conflict. Kjorn explained that just over 20 years ago, there had been a major war between the great noble houses. It was a war between the house of Erebayan, which Kjorn had served, and the great house of Zahar, and countless people had died in that conflict. Kjorn continued, saying that out of roughly 3,000 Erebayan knights at the time, more than 900 had been killed, meaning nearly a third of them perished. Sadly, everyone close to Kjorn had been among that third. Kjorn went on to speak about his friend Denver, who always said he would open a laundry shop once the war was over. He also spoke of his teacher Hartman, who constantly scolded him and insisted that he still had much to learn. Then there were his beloved wife and son. Every one of them had been massacred by House Zahar, while Kjorn alone had survived. That was why Kjorn said that Tehran's mother had been right to a certain extent. A knight's life could disappear far more easily and far more meaninglessly than that of a commoner. However, he added that there was one thing she had been wrong about, and that was Tehran's aptitude. Tehran looked confused when Kjorn brought up his aptitude. Lowering his head slightly, Kjorn admitted that it was embarrassing to say this while he was in such a state, but he considered himself a knight with fairly respectable skill. Even so, Tehran had easily destroyed a monster wraith that Kjorn himself had been unable to defeat. Kjorn explained that Tehran's potential was not merely that of a knight. At the very least, he possessed noble-level talent, and among nobles, he would rank within the upper tiers of aptitude. Hearing that, Tehran spoke up and said that his mother had always told him that his father was a knight, so he wondered if that had been a lie. Kjorn replied that on rare occasions, children with talent below that of a knight were born among nobles, while noble-class children could sometimes be born among knights. In that sense, Kjorn believed it would be better for Tehran to leave this hill and venture out into the world. Upon hearing that, Tehran asked why. Kjorn answered that humanity needed more nobles and knights. Kjorn added that humans were still not the true masters of the world. Long ago, the other races that had been cast out by the gods were still waiting and watching for an opportunity to rise once again. And in the midst of all that, the nobles continued to wage war against one another. That was why Kjorn believed that this was an age that desperately needed strong and kind nobles like Tehran. More than anything, Kjorn pointed out that Tehran himself was not truly satisfied with living his life as a shepherd, and upon hearing that, Tehran remained silent because he knew that what Kjorn had said was true. After a moment, Tehran spoke up and asked what exactly he could gain by going down beyond the mountains. Kjorn replied that it all depended on what Tehran wanted: wealth, fame, authority, family, or friendship. All of those things were difficult to obtain while remaining here, or so Kjorn questioned. He then told Turan to try imagining it for himself. He could wander the world as Kjorn did, destroying monsters that threatened innocent people. He could become an explorer who ventured into lands unknown. Or perhaps he could be adopted into a noble house and walk the path of power. Hearing all of that, Turan finally answered that after listening to Kjorn, he thought Kjorn was right. He admitted that it certainly sounded far more interesting than spending the rest of his life herding sheep on the hill. Turan then added that, for the first time in his life, he was genuinely curious about the world beyond the mountains. Upon hearing that, Kjorn smiled and admitted that he worried he might be filling Turan's head with expectations for no reason. But even so, he promised that he would support every possibility that lay before him. A moment later, Kjorn changed the subject and brought up Turan's bloodline ability, saying that it was actually something he should have asked about from the very beginning. Turan looked confused upon hearing that and did not understand what Kjorn meant. Kjorn apologized and explained that he kept forgetting how little Turan knew about magic. He then told Turan that a bloodline ability was a special trait inherited by nobles from their ancestors, the Freyans, and whether or not a person possessed a bloodline ability was also one of the major differences that separated nobles from knights. After explaining that, Kjorn asked Turan whether there was a particular spell that always felt unusually easy and natural for him to use, or perhaps some remarkable ability that he possessed which did not require him to actively use magic at all. Turan then told Kjorn that it was not really because he was strong, and that simply possessing mana naturally made a wizard's physical ability stronger. As he explained that, Turan added that he had always had a good sense of smell, and that he was also quite skilled at throwing stones. Hearing this, Kjorn replied that if Turan's sense of smell was exceptionally sharp, then it could certainly be considered a bloodline ability. He continued by explaining that being talented with thrown weapons was one of the traits associated with House Erebayon, although it was a fairly common trait among its members. Kjorn then encouraged Turan to tell him more, and Turan proceeded to describe his abilities in greater detail. Sometime later, after listening carefully, Kjorn finally stated that he understood the situation now. Hearing that, Turan became curious and asked why Kjorn was suddenly acting as though he had figured something out. Kjorn then explained that he believed he had identified which noble house Turan's abilities most closely resembled. Upon hearing that, Turan immediately asked which house he belonged to. Kjorn answered that the bloodline seemed to trace back to one of the great houses, a family known as the Pursuers or Hunters. It was none other than House Sahar, the very same house that had once fought a devastating war against House Erebayon. Hearing those words, Turan was visibly surprised. He quietly repeated the name that Kjorn had spoken, realizing that he shared the same bloodline as the enemies of the old knight standing before him. Turan immediately began wondering what he should say. Part of him felt as though he should apologize to Kjorn. However, he quickly reminded himself that the people involved in that war were relatives he had never met and were, for all practical purposes, complete strangers to him. While he was lost in those thoughts, Kjorn suddenly called out his name. Looking directly at him, Kjorn told Turan not to make such a worried expression. He reminded him that Turan had never participated in that war himself. Even so, Turan still could not help feeling uncomfortable about the situation. Kjorn, however, reassured him that it was a matter between adults of a previous generation. If people continued trying to wash blood with blood, then the cycle of fighting would never come to an end. Hearing that, Turan asked Kjorn if he had any regrets. Kjorn looked at him and asked what he meant by that. Turan then explained that he was referring to Kjorn telling him to go down the mountain. Upon hearing that, Kjorn replied that if Turan chose to leave the mountain and pursue power, he would inevitably end up joining the Zahar family, since he possessed such outstanding abilities. However, as he said that, Kjorn added that he trusted Turan's character, which surprised Turan. Kjorn explained that he was talking about the goodness within Turan. After all, Turan had chosen to save him even though doing so meant revealing an identity he had hidden for his entire life. In fact, Kjorn added that if someone like Turan joined the Zahar family and rose to a high position within it, perhaps he could help prevent another terrible war like the one in the past from ever happening again. Upon hearing those words, Turan simply stood there in silence without saying a single word. A moment later, Kjorn began walking away and, as he did, he told Turan that there was no need to think too seriously about it right now. After all, it was not as though Turan had already decided whether or not he would join the Zahar family. Just as Kjorn was walking away, Turan suddenly spoke up and told him that his thoughts were clear now. He then added that he wanted to try going down the mountain. Hearing that, Kiorn smiled and said that Turan had thought it through well. However, Turan quickly added that he did not mean right away and that he would only head down after Kiorn's injuries had fully healed. Hearing that, Kiorn remarked that Turan was kind, though he insisted that his injuries were nothing more than a few scratches. Sometime later, the two were back at the house. Kiorn then spoke up and told Turan that mana was absolutely necessary for using magic, which was why mana was commonly referred to as the key to omnipotence. Hearing that, Turan wondered what exactly that meant. Kiorn then continued, explaining that mana was not truly an omnipotent power despite what the name might suggest. Rather, in order to use magic, one needed an amount of mana that matched the spell they wished to cast. Turan then asked Kiorn what the standard was for determining whether one's mana matched a spell, and Kiorn replied that he was about to explain that. Raising 3 fingers, Kiorn said that the difficulty of magic was largely determined by 3 factors. The first was bloodline, the second was affinity, and the third was causality. He began with bloodline, explaining that it was determined by the blood one was born with. This was something that applied to most nobles rather than knights. As an example, Kiorn said that it would normally be difficult for a person to heal their wounds using magic, and Turan nodded in agreement. Kiorn then continued, explaining that for the Revista bloodline from the south, healing was something they could do naturally even without any special training. That was the kind of power that came directly from one's bloodline. Turan then asked about the second factor, affinity. Kiorn replied that Turan could think of it as familiarity. It referred to the idea that a wizard could more easily perform tasks that they preferred or were accustomed to doing. Hearing that, Turan brought up the fireball he had created earlier, asking if it was similar to how he had made the fireball, as though he were simply throwing a rock. Kiorn immediately confirmed that it was exactly like that. He added that if Turan had merely tried to create flames without applying that familiar concept, he likely would not have achieved the same speed or destructive power. Kiorn then moved on to the final factor and explained that it was the most important of all, causality. He admitted that even he did not fully understand every aspect of it. Kiorn then posed a question to Turan and asked what he thought would happen if he tried to kill Kiorn directly using only mana. Turan thought for a moment before answering that perhaps some light would shine from Kiorn's head, and that would be the end of it. Hearing that, Kiorn replied that this was exactly the kind of phenomenon caused by a lack of causality. As he spoke, he placed his hand on top of a cup and explained that when there was no appropriate cause leading to a desired result, or when the outcome one wished to achieve was excessively difficult, that principle came into effect. As soon as he finished speaking, he activated his magic, and the water inside the cup immediately began to boil. In that moment, Turan spoke up and said that he felt like he understood causality a little better now. He explained that if he wanted to kill Kiorn, then rather than simply spending mana while wishing for Kiorn's death, he would need to create a proper cause of death, such as creating flames and firing them at him. As he said that, Turan summoned a fireball and used it to heat the cup until the water inside began to boil. Turan continued, saying that creating and launching fire felt far more natural than trying to directly ignite something. Hearing that explanation, Kiorn became excited that Turan had grasped the concept so quickly and remarked that Turan could have become a scholar instead of a mage. However, Turan then brought up another question. He explained that he was able to control ordinary animals as he pleased, so he wondered why magical beasts required something as complicated as causality. Kiorn replied that it was because of their mana. After that, the two continued discussing magic with one another for hours. Sometime later, Turan spoke up again and commented that magic seemed surprisingly easy. In response, Kiorn explained that an excellent mage did not simply know how to use mana. A truly skilled mage also understood the principles, logic, and circumstances behind its use. Turan then recalled something and wondered aloud whether the Zahar bloodline possessed any special magic of its own. Kiorn answered that the Zahar bloodline excelled in stealth and tracking abilities. He then suggested that Turan try using it himself, and Turan agreed. Closing his eyes, Turan focused his thoughts. He wished not to be seen by anyone, and he also wished for neither his sound nor his scent to be detected. The moment he concentrated on those thoughts, something changed. Kiorn had been carefully observing him when Turan suddenly asked if anything had happened. As Turan spoke, it became apparent that he had completely vanished from Kiorn's sight. Surprised by what he was witnessing, Kiorn immediately told Turan that he had succeeded and that he could no longer see him at all. Even now, Kiorn remained astonished because there was absolutely nothing visible in front of him, despite the fact that he could still clearly hear Turan speaking. A moment later, Turan finally released the ability and emerged from his state of concealment. Kiorn then spoke up and told him that it had been a long time since he had seen that ability, but it was every bit as frightening as he remembered. He added that during the war, the Erebion Knights had feared that ability more than any other. Turan then remarked that this seemed like an unfairly powerful ability, but Kiorn told him that he should always keep in mind that it was not invincible. After saying that, Kiorn changed the topic and informed Turan that he would teach him several methods for training his magic. Hearing that, Turan questioned whether Kiorn was not teaching far too much to a mage who belonged to an enemy family. However, Kiorn replied that Turan had saved his life and even treated his injuries. On top of that, Kiorn said that he trusted Turan's character, and as he spoke, a warm smile appeared on his face. In the next scene, a short bald man could be seen looking confused after hearing that Turan was planning to sell his sheep and leave the village. He questioned who was supposed to take care of the shepherding from now on, and he also wondered how Turan could make such a major decision without consulting anyone. Turan responded by telling the bald man that the villagers should figure out how to find a new shepherd themselves. He then questioned why it should matter to them what he chose to do with his own belongings. Turan then changed the subject and addressed the man along with the other villagers gathered there. He told them that he hoped they would buy the sheep at a fair price. Otherwise, he planned to release all of them and leave. Turan added that everyone was free to try capturing the sheep afterward, but they would probably have a very difficult time doing so. One of the men immediately called out to the village chief regarding the matter. The bald old man, who happened to be the village chief, silently thought to himself that Turan was someone who always followed through on his words, so nothing good would come from provoking him further. In the end, the village chief had no choice but to agree. He handed the money over to Turan and told him that whether he chose to stay or leave was entirely his own business, and that he was free to do as he pleased. With that settled, Turan and Kiorn left the village together. As the two traveled along the road, Turan suddenly spoke up and mentioned that now that he thought about it, the villagers still owed Kiorn compensation for everything that had happened. He wondered if they should go back and collect it. However, Kiorn replied that he had no intention of receiving any compensation and pointed out that it was Turan who had actually dealt with the magical beast. Hearing that, Turan simply accepted Kiorn's answer and continued walking alongside him. Eventually, the two came to a stop as a fork in the road appeared before them, with two paths leading in opposite directions. Looking at the crossroads, Kiorn quietly remarked that this was where the two of them would part ways. Kiorn then apologized to Turan for refusing to travel together, and explained that he was simply more comfortable being alone. Turan replied that it was fine and thanked Kiorn for everything he had done. Smiling warmly, Kiorn told Turan to take care of himself, and Turan smiled back and said that he hoped they would meet again someday with smiles on their faces. And so, the boy stood there watching Kiorn's retreating figure for a long time, and only later did he realize why he had not wanted the old knight to speak to him so formally. Although he had never lacked affection from his mother, the boy had secretly longed for a father figure, someone who could serve as a role model and show him what kind of man he should become. In the next scene, footprints stretched across the desert, and within the vast and silent wasteland, a boy could be seen walking through the sand. It was none other than Turan himself. As he shielded his eyes from the blowing wind, he suddenly looked ahead and spotted a group of people in the distance. Wondering if they were traveling merchants who moved from village to village, Turan felt relieved and immediately made his way toward them. As he stepped into their path, a man with an eye patch spoke up and asked who Turan was to block their way. Turan replied that he was traveling alone and politely requested that they tell him the location of the nearest city. The man then informed him that if he followed the road they had come from, he would eventually reach a city called Muriai. Hearing that, Turan thanked them for the information and proceeded to continue on his way. However, just as he started walking, one of the men stopped him and, with a menacing tone, asked if he was really planning to leave after getting the information he wanted. Hearing that, Turan looked at the man in confusion, unsure of what he meant. Turan then asked them what exactly he was supposed to do, and the man replied that if someone received something, they should also give something in return. As he said that, the rest of the men drew their swords and surrounded Turan from all sides. With a threatening look, the man then ordered Turan to take off the bag he was carrying. Turan questioned whether they were bandits, and the man immediately responded by asking what it mattered if they were. The eye-patch man then flashed a menacing smile and told Turan that he had been reckless. He explained that this was a wasteland where no one would find it strange if someone ended up dead, so he advised Turan to hand over his bag and cloak while they were still being nice about it. As he spoke, He pointed his sword directly at Turan's neck and added that killing him and stripping him of his belongings would only create an unnecessary mess and require far more work. Turan, however, did not budge in the slightest. Instead, he calmly told them that he understood the situation now. He then added that bandits who robbed and even killed people would make the perfect prey for him to practice his magic on. As he said those words, Turan looked at the bandits and revealed a menacing smile of his own. In that moment, one of the bandits let out a chuckle, drawing Turan's attention, and the bandit went on to say that Turan was talking as if he were some kind of wizard. The other bandits quickly agreed with him. However, before any of them could react further, Turan casually waved his hand and unleashed a powerful gust of wind magic that sent the bandits flying high into the air. As he did so, Turan thought to himself that shaping the wind with his hand and amplifying it required far less mana than simply generating wind out of thin air. While realizing this, he noted that he had not known he could create such a powerful gust using so little mana. The bandits who survived the initial attack were left stunned by what had just happened. Turan, however, did not stop there. He immediately took out his water bottle and manipulated the water inside, forming multiple spear-shaped shards of ice. One of the bandits noticed what Turan was doing, but before he could react, Turan launched the icy spearhead straight at him, killing him instantly. After doing so, Turan remarked that, honestly, simply throwing stones still felt faster and stronger. At that moment, the eye patch man desperately pleaded with Turan, saying that they had not known he was a wizard and begging for forgiveness just this once. However, the moment those words left his mouth, the remaining bandits launched a surprise attack at Turan. Unfortunately for them, Turan had already sensed their intentions. In an instant, he summoned sharp spears of sand from beneath the ground, piercing through the bodies of every attacker. The eye patch man stared in disbelief as all of his companions were killed in a single moment. Turan then spoke up and told him that there was something he wanted to know. Terrified, the eye patch man quickly replied that Turan could ask him anything. Turan then asked the man why they had attacked him without any sort of plan and pointed out that a traveler walking alone could very well have been a wizard, just as he was. Hearing that, the man answered that it was because Turan had bowed his head to them, which left Turan confused. The eye patch man continued, explaining that even when they had spoken to him rudely, Turan had still bowed and greeted them politely, so they naturally assumed he was just an ordinary person. Upon hearing that explanation, Turan thanked the man and said that he had taught him something useful. The man immediately looked relieved and asked whether Turan would spare his life now. However, even as he spoke, a small sphere of water had already formed above his head. In that moment, Turan remembered something Kjorn had told him. Kjorn had said that from now on, Turan would meet many different kinds of people, and there was one thing he absolutely wanted him to remember. He told Turan to never show mercy to scum like bandits, the kind of people who did not hesitate to harm others for their own profit. Kjorn had firmly explained that the reason he was so certain about this was because a life spared out of pity could eventually go on to harm 10 innocent people. Returning to the present, Turan stared silently at the body of the bandit he had finally killed. After a moment, he decided that it was time to move on. As he traveled along the road, the wheel tracks left behind in the sand by the merchants-turned-bandits remained clearly visible, and those marks etched a single thought deeply into his mind. He had killed people. He felt guilt over what he had done, but at the same time, he knew he could not have simply let them go. Kjorn's warning echoed through his thoughts once more. People who could casually decide to rob and murder others for profit would undoubtedly target more victims whenever the opportunity arose. Like the wheel tracks in the desert that gradually faded away as weeds slowly grew over them. The turmoil within Turan's heart also began to settle as he reflected on Kjorn's teachings. Before long, he found himself standing before an entirely new world. Looking ahead, Turan could not hide his amazement at the sight before him, for he had finally arrived at the small city known as Murai. As he entered the city, countless people could be seen walking through the streets, and as Turan made his way through the crowds, he thought to himself that this was the first time he had ever seen so many people gathered in one place. Even the architecture was completely different from what he was used to in the village. Now, it truly felt as though he had arrived in a real city. As he looked around, he approached one of the street vendors, and the shopkeeper immediately asked what he needed. Turan, however, replied that he was not actually a customer, and as he said that, he recalled Kjorn's advice that if he ever reached a city and needed a place to stay, he should look for an inn, since almost every village or city usually had one. The shopkeeper, however, looked annoyed and waved his hand dismissively at Tehran, telling him to get lost if he was not going to buy any fruit. Tehran found himself wondering why the shopkeeper was being so rude and even questioned whether there was some unspoken rule in cities that required people to buy fruit before asking a question. Thinking about that, Tehran pointed toward one of the fruits and asked how much it cost. The shopkeeper replied that it was 2 dupit. As Tehran reached for his wallet, the shopkeeper remarked that he looked like an outsider and probably did not know what that meant. So he added that paying with other coins would be fine as well. After handing over the money, Tehran asked the shopkeeper where he could find Min. The shopkeeper told him to head straight past the cake shop and then turn left, where he would find a building with a blue roof. He added that it was the largest inn in the city. Sometime later, Tehran arrived at the inn and was greeted by one of the beautiful staff members working there, a woman named Lena. As she observed him, Lena commented that he was quite a handsome guest. Slightly flustered by the compliment, Tehran asked how much it cost to stay for one night. With a warm smile, Lena answered that the price was 16 dupit. Hearing that, Tehran immediately replied that he would stay there. He then changed the subject and told Lena that there was something he wanted to ask. Curious, Lena asked what it was. Tehran then asked whether there was a monster nearby with a bounty on it. And upon hearing that unexpected question, Lena looked visibly surprised. Tehran thought to himself that he needed to kill monsters and absorb their mana, and Kjorn had also told him that hunting monsters was a good way to earn money. He then asked Lena why she was not answering his question, but Lena simply smiled and told him that nothing in this world came for free. A few moments later, Tehran repeated the words City Hall to himself, wondering what exactly that meant. Lena looked surprised that he did not know about city halls and was amazed to learn that he truly came from the countryside. She then explained that city halls were places where various public affairs were handled and that the officials working there were employed by the city's lord. Lena added that it was probably already closed since the sun had gone down, but if Tehran wanted information about monster bounties, he should visit the city hall the following day. She then changed the topic and asked Tehran if he was a monster hunter. Hearing that, Tehran asked what a monster hunter was. Lena explained that people often said that if an ordinary person hunted monsters, they could eventually become a wizard. After saying that, she asked Tehran if he also wanted to become a wizard. At that moment, a hand was suddenly placed on Tehran's shoulder, and the person behind him remarked that anyone who believed such a superstition was an idiot. Tehran was surprised to hear that it was considered a superstition. He turned around and saw an unfamiliar man smiling at him. The man's name was Midden, and he was a monster hunter. Midden then added that it was actually a proven fact that someone could become a wizard by killing monsters, and he claimed that he had seen it happen with his own eyes. Upon seeing Midden, Lena looked surprised and commented that he was still alive. Hearing that, Midden confidently replied that he had no intention of dying until he became a wizard. Tehran removed Midden's hand from his shoulder, and realizing what he had done, Midden quickly apologized for placing his hand on him without permission. Tehran then stood up and said that more importantly, he wanted to hear more about what Midden had just mentioned. Midden asked if he meant the part about becoming a wizard by killing monsters. He then explained that wizards grew stronger whenever they hunted monsters, and by the same principle, an ordinary person who killed a monster could awaken as a wizard. Midden pointed toward his team and added that all 4 of them were hunting monsters in hopes of becoming wizards, and the other 3 immediately agreed with him. Tehran then asked whether that meant one of them had already become a wizard, but Midden answered no, adding that in this city there were only the Lord's wizards along with 3 others serving under him. Midden then asked Tehran whether he hunted monsters as well, saying that if he did, his equipment looked far too shabby for the job. He wondered if Tehran even carried a weapon. In response, Tehran showed them his sling, and after examining it, Midden remarked that judging by how worn it was, Tehran must have used it extensively. Tehran agreed, explaining that it was useful for quickly firing objects about the size of an egg. Looking at it more closely, Midden commented that with a weapon like that, Tehran could easily hunt rabbit or fox monsters. He then changed the topic and mentioned that they had just been wishing for one more range fighter, so he asked whether Tehran had any interest in joining their hunting party. Hearing the offer, Tehran thought about it carefully for a moment before smiling and politely declining, though he thanked Midden for the invitation. Later that night, Tehran lay on his bed and reflected on the situation, deciding that there was no real reason for him to go hunting together with them. As he thought back on everything that had happened that day, he concluded that it had been an incredibly chaotic day. He still found it hard to believe that he had actually left the village behind. Raising his hand and watching mana flow through it, he quietly wondered what awaited him from this point onward. Just then, he heard a sound coming from outside, followed by a knock on the door. Tehran immediately got up and called out, asking who was there. In that moment, Turan remembered something Kjorn had told him, and that was that even while staying in an inn, he should never let his guard down. When Turan had asked if that was really necessary, Kjorn had answered yes. Kjorn went on to explain that a city was not automatically a safe place, so he warned Turan never to lower his guard no matter where he was. Turan had understood and remembered those words well. Back in the present, Turan had already activated his magic and cautiously approached the door. As he slowly opened it, he discovered that the person standing outside was none other than Lena, who greeted him with a warm smile and asked whether he had already gone to sleep. Lena then explained that she thought the room might be cold, so she had come to keep him warm. Hearing that, Turan looked confused and asked what exactly she meant. In response, Lena smiled at him in a seductive manner. She told him that it meant exactly what it sounded like, leaving Turan even more puzzled. Stepping a little closer, Lena explained that for a small amount of money, she would do whatever he wanted. Turan, however, asked what she would do if there was nothing he wanted. Refusing to believe him, Lena continued her teasing and insisted that he should stop pretending because she could tell just by looking at his face. However, when the focus shifted to Turan, his expression remained completely unchanged. Seeing that he showed no sign of excitement whatsoever, Lena was visibly surprised. At that moment, Turan recalled another piece of advice Kjorn had given him. Kjorn had warned him to be especially careful around maids and prostitutes, explaining that many of them carried diseases. He had added that wizards possess strong resistance to illness, so it was usually not a problem for them personally, but carelessness could still result in passing those diseases on to others later. Because of that, Kjorn had advised Turan not to let temporary desire push him into doing something he might regret. A short while later, Lena could be seen leaving in frustration, while Turan remained behind, deep in thought. He found himself thinking that city life was not as simple as he had imagined. First there had been the fruit vendor, and now Lena as well. The idea that even a small conversation or a bit of information seemed to come with a price was something he had never expected. As he reflected on everything, Turan concluded that cities were far colder and more calculating than he had imagined. Right at that moment, as he was thinking about it, Turan could hear voices coming from outside. One of Midden's companions remarked that there was something he had been curious about, and he asked why Midden had tried to recruit Turan earlier. Another man added that Turan did not look like he would be much help anyway. A third agreed, saying that Turan had a cocky mouth and would probably make perfect monster bait. Turan listened quietly without reacting. But before the conversation could continue, Midden spoke up and told his companions that it was because Turan reminded him of himself when he was younger. He added that hearing Turan hunted with a weapon like that had made him worry. Midden continued, explaining that if Turan stayed close to him, he figured the young man might survive a little longer. Hearing that, the others commented that Midden was too kind-hearted. Turan smiled warmly after hearing those words and thought to himself that perhaps the city was not as cold-hearted as he had first believed. Sometime later, inside the city hall, Turan was greeted by one of the staff members, who politely asked what he needed. Turan first asked whether the man was an official, and after receiving confirmation, he explained that he had come to hunt monsters. The official looked slightly surprised upon hearing that. At that moment, Turan recalled something Kjorn had once told him, namely that the world would not be kind to him. When Turan had asked why, Kjorn explained that if he looked at it from the opposite perspective, there was no reason for the world to be kind either. Kjorn added that if Turan wanted people to treat him kindly, the solution was simple: reveal that he was a wizard. Once people learned that, ordinary folk would immediately bow their heads before him. Back in the present, the official handed Turan a bounty list and informed him that he was not allowed to take it away. He could look through it as much as he wanted, but he would have to return it afterward. As Turan looked at the monster on the bounty list, he wondered if it was some kind of crow monster, prompting the official to sarcastically ask whether it looked like a cat to him. The man then added that although it was unlikely, if Turan ever killed a monster, he was required to bring its corpse back into the city. He further explained that if a wizard failed to disperse a monster's mana, it would turn into a wraith, and under city law, anyone who killed a monster and abandoned the body could face the maximum punishment of execution. Hearing that, Turan thought to himself that he already knew what happened when monsters became wraiths, and he reminded himself that he could not afford to make the same mistake again. Turan then asked the official whether knights did not hunt monsters, causing the man to ask if Turan thought knights had spare time on their hands. The official explained that a knight's duty was to maintain public order within the city, while hunting monsters outside the walls was left to people like Turan. After hearing that, Turan placed the bounty list back on the table and left. Watching him go, the official thought to himself that there would probably be another corpse piling up outside the city before long, clearly referring to Tehran.